Welcome back to another Explainer. Today we're doing something really unique. We're bridging the visceral, clinical facts of ancient Roman history with the massive emotional impact of literature and theology. We're going to examine one of the most brutal execution methods ever devised, and specifically look at the historical execution of Jesus Christ to see how this sheer severity shaped storytelling and religious doctrine for millennia. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand the gravity of this topic, we've got to grasp how the ancients themselves viewed it. Take the famous Roman philosopher Cicero. He actually viewed this execution method as so unimaginably horrific that he believed the mere word should be completely banished from a Roman citizen's mind. To him, it was just a fundamentally disgusting punishment.
Section 1. History of the Roman Cross. Before we look at the literary and theological impact, we need to ground this explainer in the stark reality of history.
And to instantly establish the severity of what we're talking about, literally just look at the English language. You know the word excruciating? Well, it was invented entirely to describe this specific agony. It literally translates to out of the cross. Think about that. The pain was of such an extreme magnitude that existing vocabulary just wasn't enough to capture it. Now, you might think the cross was a Roman invention, but it actually wasn't. It was created by the Persians around 400 BC. Then Alexander the Great brings it to the Mediterranean, and eventually the Phoenicians introduce it to Rome. But it was the Romans who spent 500 years perfecting it. And I mean perfecting it, not just for death, but for maximum public spectacle and deterrent, right up until Emperor Constantine abolished it in the 4th century AD.
Section 2. Medical Pathology of Crucifixion. Let's shift our lens and take a clinical look at what actually happens to the body here.
The pathology of the cross is, quite simply, the systematic destruction of the human body. And the trauma actually began before the physical violence even started. Historical texts note that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus suffered from hematidrosis. That's a rare medical condition where extreme psychological stress literally causes hemorrhage into the sweat glands. And from there, it just cascades. We're talking deep lacerations from scourging, the dislocation of shoulders and elbows as the body hangs unsupported, massive median nerve damage from iron spikes, and ultimately the cause of death, exhaustion asphyxia, which is a fatal interference with normal breathing. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the instrument used just prior to the crucifixion, the Roman flagellum. This absolutely wasn't your standard whip. It had leather thongs tied with small iron balls and sharp pieces of sheep bone. So, when struck with full force, these materials would cut deep into the subcutaneous tissues and tear into underlying skeletal muscles, producing these quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. It's immense trauma that immediately sets the stage for hypovolemic shock.
And that blood loss brings us to a really staggering number, 75 to 125 pounds. That was the massive weight of the crossbar, known as the patibulum, that the victim was forced to carry to the execution site. Because of this severe blood loss and that pre-shock state from the scourging, historical records tell us Jesus was actually too weak to carry this mass and collapsed under the burden.
What's fascinating is how modern medicine actually validates the historical texts here. The gospel accounts report this sudden flow of blood and water when a soldier pierced Jesus' side to ensure he was dead, while clinical experts note that the spear thrust likely pierced the pleura, the side or flank, releasing fluid from the pericardial cavity or maybe inflammatory exudate from ischemic bowels, which becomes grossly hemorrhagic as the body goes into profound shock. It's literally a clinical validation of the ancient accounts.
Moving on to Section 3, Agony in Literary Storytelling. Now that we have the medical facts, let's see how storytellers harness this level of visceral agony.
You see, extreme physical trauma has this unique power to build emotional narratives. Take this striking excerpt from Ursula K. Le Guin's sci-fi classic, The Left Hand of Darkness, which popped up recently in a really fascinating literature discussion on Reddit. The narrator is describing the horrifying reality of holding a dying man who was beaten to death in a transport truck. The imagery is harrowing, right? Wearing someone else's blood as a dry, stiff brown garment. Authors use this kind of raw bodily trauma, which mirrors the absolute destruction of ancient Roman punishments, to force us to confront ultimate despair.
And when you put this modern storytelling right next to ancient texts, the parallels are pretty undeniable. On one side, we have visceral survival imagery from modern sci-fi. On the other, raw prophetic descriptions from the biblical book of Isaiah, written centuries before the crucifixion, predicting a figure whose appearance would be disfigured beyond that of any man and his form marred beyond human likeness. Both of these rely on that universal power of extreme bodily destruction to communicate suffering that words can barely contain.
Section 4, Suffering and religious doctrine. Let's impartially explore how this historical brutality serves as the bedrock for deeply held theological beliefs.
When looking at the biblical perspective, Jesus isn't portrayed just as a helpless victim of state violence. The text suggests he was a conscious participant. So that extreme anguish in Gethsemane, the hematrodrosis we talked about earlier, wasn't just a totally rational fear of the physical cross. Theological doctrine posits it was actually the horror of anticipating the spiritual weight of human sin, bearing divine wrath, and facing complete alienation from the divine presence.
So, the crucial point is understanding a concept called penal substitution. In Christian theology, the severe physical and spiritual suffering we've just outlined wasn't arbitrary at all. It was a required, penal payment. Based on the biblical axiom that the wages of sin is death, this doctrine asserts that the sheer physical horror of the Roman cross served as the necessary cosmic penalty to achieve divine atonement. Essentially, the suffering itself is the mechanism of salvation.
And finally, Section 5, the legacy of the cross. Let's bring our historical, literary, and theological lenses all together.
Starting with the clinical facts of history actually magnifies the emotional resonance of the whole narrative. The Roman cross wasn't just a method of execution. Its brutal reality became a linchpin. It grounds the theological concept of divine atonement in undeniable historical trauma. And at the exact same time, it gives Western culture its foundational vocabulary for describing ultimate, transcendent suffering in our literature and art.
We've covered a lot of really intense ground in this explainer today, from the engineering of ancient torture to the heights of theological doctrine. But I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. How does grasping the stark medical and historical reality of Roman crucifixion alter your own understanding of the emotional and religious narratives that have shaped Western storytelling for millennia? Does knowing the clinical facts change how you read the story? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. And as always, keep learning.